What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I want to share the number one place you should be looking for fall bass, whether you want to catch numbers or really big fish, and that's ditches. Ditches are basically areas where an old creek channel runs into a flat, and I have a really good image here pulled up from Sam Rayburn Lake when the lake was drawn down really low one year. And basically we have the land here, which is an offshore flat. And if we take the image ahead in time, you can see that usually this is completely covered up with water. This lake is like 11 foot low at the time. So really what we have is a great look at what ditches are. And what I'm going to do is actually trace out some of these ditches for you guys to show you what these ditches are and where you can kind of find them. So I just drew a couple of ditches right there. Let's draw another one right here. So I'm tracing out all of these little ditches, and again, it's just areas where the creek channel runs into a flat. And you can actually do this on Google Earth and then either use your path or just use waypoints to sketch out these ditches and then transfer them to your fish finder. I'll link a video down in the description of how to do that. You can actually, just mark down with these lines or with waypoints and just kind of mark the edge of that ditch like that. But we can also look at it in a contour map, which I'll show you here in a second. But basically, if we take the lake back to normal pool now, you can see that these ditches are out here in the very middle of the lake. But they are almost the same thing as these creek channels and creeks that you see that cut into the actual land. So a lot of guys know, okay, in the fall, I need to be looking for fish that are moving into the backs of creeks. And so they'll actually go to a creek and go to the very back of it and start fishing. And while that is effective, it's what a lot of anglers are doing. And what I like to do instead then is to try to do what other anglers aren't doing, and that is using the same mentality or the same methodology and basically move into the back of a creek, but do it in these ditches that are offshore that get a lot less pressure from other anglers. So you could almost treat the back right here of this ditch where it kind of meets that flat, where it kind of ends right there. This is basically like the back of a creek that you would see maybe over here or over here that is now out of water. So instead of actually going into the back of this creek or the back of this creek when the water is high, I'm going to be going to the back of this ditch, the back of this ditch, the back of this ditch, trying to find groups of fish. Now, it's a little bit harder to actually find fish in these ditches because of two things. One, there's not actually active water that's feeding into the backs of these creeks like you'll have with these bigger visible creeks. So bait fish are not going to as reliably pull up into these ditches as they do in the backs of these creeks. So it's going to take you longer, and you're going to have to graph and fish a lot more ditches before actually finding fish compared to these creeks where you can basically run to the back of almost any creek and find some fish in the fall. The advantage, though, is that there's not a bunch of anglers fishing the back of these ditches like they are in the backs of the creeks. So when you do find a spot that has fish, they're going to be absolutely loaded in it. And the way I basically would approach this if I'm on the lake is using my fish finder to graph these ditches to try to find ones that have bait fish in it. I would basically go through and follow my mapping or follow waypoints I would make on my unit, like or on Google Earth, and transfer them over to my unit. And I'm basically just going to drive my boat through the middle of these ditches, looking at my 2D sonar and down scan and side scan to find balls of bait fish. If I can find balls of either shad or perch or even bluegill if you're fishing up north, you're going to likely find a concentration of bass somewhere in that area. Now, the bass might not be setting directly in the middle of this ditch chasing the shad. They might be on the edges of the ditch, setting up in, shallower water on the edge around stumps and brush and stuff like that. And that's basically like when you go into the back of a creek like this, you'll use this creek. There are fish that set up in the middle of this creek here, but there's also a lot of fish that pull up to the bank and set up in shallow bushes, shallow bank grass, things like that. And so you're going to have fish that set out in the middle of these backs, these pockets, and against the bank. And it's the same thing for these ditches. There are going to be fish that are setting up in the middle of these ditches, but also on the edges of the ditches in and around cover. So if you can find the bait fish, the next step is to figure out, are the fish setting up more on top of this flat around stumps and rocks and brush, or are they in the dead center of this ditch, either in some like offshore grass like you have on here on Rayburn, or just suspended on bait fish, which then might require you to use your 2D sonar and fish vertically for them, or to use forward-facing sonar to chase those fish around. Kind of just depends on the day. So that is kind of the concept of ditches, and that's what they look like here in Texas. But I do want to show you what they look like on a contour map and a few other types of lakes that are different from what you may normally see. So for all the guys over in the Nashville area, I wanted to basically use a couple lakes over here. One is Old Hickory Lake on the Tennessee River, and then we're also going to look at another lake over here in just a second. But first up, let's take a look at Old Hickory. So basically, Old Hickory is a long river system type lake. It has main river ledges. It has a lot of drop-offs. And in the fall, if I'm fishing a lake like this, whether it is actually like Old Hickory or maybe some of my lakes over here in Arkansas that's set up similar, what I like to do is try to find areas where you have a ditch that comes off of the main river channel and is feeding into the back of a flat or feeding into the back of a creek over here. And a lot of these fish are going to be setting up on these ditches that cut in from the main channel. So here's the main channel out here, and then we have this ditch that cuts right here. You can see you have shallower water on both sides and deeper water in the middle. That's what a ditch looks like on your mapping. So that ditch right there is a pretty obvious ditch, but a lot of fish may be pushing into this ditch, feeding into this small creek, setting up on this little hump right here, which looks like it has some grass, or just setting out in the middle, again, chasing shad. Now, this is a pretty obvious ditch, but there's some that are a lot less obvious, and that's kind of, again, also what I'm trying to focus on. I don't want to find the most obvious ditches. So, for example, here's a really good one right off this main river that is feeding into a little marina or flat bank. And a lot of these fish will set up on these flatter banks in the fall, opposite of the main river channel, and the bait fish will push up in here, especially if they have like a marina or something there to kind of get attracted to. And so these fish, while they will be on this bank, will also feed off this main river using this ditch, which is right here where my cursor is, and you can see there's a little hump right here. So these fish can set up on this little hump or high spot, or just in the middle of that ditch if there's grass or bait, and set up an ambush there. Let's try to find a couple more ditches just to kind of show you. We may be actually running out of deep enough water going this way, so let's kind of go back another direction. So if we go back into more of like an actual defined creek here, you can still have ditches back in these creeks all the way to the very, very back. They just set up a little bit different. So for example, if we go way back into this creek, you still have a ditch here that cuts into, for example, this little deal, but it is more obvious because there's an actual pocket there. It's kind of easy to see. So if you can find something that's a little bit less obvious, or a ditch that isn't as visible, that can a lot of times be better. So an example would be like right here. This is almost like a sneaky ditch where it feeds this channel right here, kind of, but everyone's going to get caught up on this other side of this main drop where there's a really nice point and there's this creek channel. But over here, we have a little ditch that cuts in here, and it actually hits up against a nice point here and another one. And this little ditch right here could be absolutely loaded up with fish. A lot of anglers are going to be pressuring this steeper drop side and not focusing on this other more subtle ditch. And these fish get set up again on these little points here, or just in the middle of that ditch right there. Another little ditch that cuts in that's kind of interesting is right here. It cuts off that main channel, swings around, and then cuts in here. And there's a small little high spot right there, and there's a little ditch that cuts there. These are not as obvious as those Rayburn ditches we were showing you earlier, but as you can see, there are a lot of ditches that you can actually find. Here's another little ditch that feeds into this short little pocket just off that main river. You don't actually have a creek that it feeds, so this is an even really nice sneaky ditch that guys might not really think about fishing unless they have their contour maps and they're really focused on it. So that's another little ditch right there. So that's what it looks like on some of these like Tennessee river-ish style lakes, or like these more river system style lakes. But we can also look at a few other types of lakes. So if we just go a little bit south of Nashville over here, we can take a look at this lake here. And basically, on a lake that is, I'm trying to give you like an aerial view, a lake that's flatter and maybe not. It's still windy. So like Percy Priest is a pretty windy lake, but it has more like flat area around it rather than being like a straight river. There are flats and stuff like that, but it's steeper than Rayburn. So Rayburn is like a super flat lowland reservoir. The Tennessee River style, like Old Hickory, is very narrow with kind of just a little bit of flats, and then Percy Priest is kind of a combination of the two, where you have some steeper banks like a highland reservoir, but also some flatter banks. And so these type of lakes are great for finding fish in ditches and things like that. So if we kind of roll around, we can find several of them pretty easily just by looking around at the map. You can find ditches all over the place. There's a little ditch that cuts into the backside of this island right here. There's another ditch that cuts right here off this main channel a little bit up to like a nice shallow point. Here's a really nice ditch that I would actually fish a lot if I was out this time of year, where you have actually like four things going on. You have main river channel right here. You have more of like a main lake structure spot. You have an island right here where if the lake isn't drawn down, the wind and stuff could push through here. But even if it's not drawn down, or even if it is drawn down, you still have a nice little pocket then that can kind of corral the bait fish into this little zone. And then you also have a ditch that cuts against a flat bank. So this ditch cuts in right here. This is the ditch I'm talking about. And it cuts into a dead flat bank. And what happens is that these bait fish are going to get caught up against this little bank right here, especially if you get a nice wind blowing out of the east. It'll get caught up right here, come out of this main channel. And a lot of anglers aren't even going to think to fish this bank because it doesn't have a nice pocket or a nice little indent like you would find on other spots. But these bait fish can stack up in that ditch, and they can also set up on either side around these little shallower points and even kind of moving into this island. And so you may be able to find that the fish are actually in that ditch itself, or they're just in the general zone, potentially even just on the bank right here, where you can go in and throw a spinnerbait and a crankbait on the bank. So ditches are basically a way to find spots that congregate fish, and you don't necessarily have to fish the ditch itself. You can fish the shallower spots around it, fish the banks around it, but in general, the more subtle the ditch or the less obvious it is to the naked eye or on a map, the better it's going to be. So if we kind of keep scrolling around, again, the ditches I always try to find are ones that don't cause, for example, like a really obvious cove or turn in a pocket like that one right there, because those are just way too easy to see. And so I spend a lot of time studying these maps, and I only found one of them, so I'm gonna try to find one more for you guys. I'm just gonna look around on the map and see if I can see one really quick. I found that one in my preparation, and I need to find another one here. You can see it's actually not that easy to find these ditches either that are less obvious, that don't like run right into a pocket. I'm not finding one even just like looking around quickly. This is why I spent hours and hours of map study on my local lakes trying to dissect this. Here's a really interesting it's a semi-ditch, semi-ridge, and then there's another ditch right here. So this is kind of some of the stuff I'm talking about. So there's a little bit of a pocket right here, but it's really hard to tell. It's a fairly straight bank, but there's a ditch that runs right in here that's pretty subtle, high spots on either side. So this would be like a little deal I would check out. And also over here, again, there's a little bit of a pocket there, but it's a pretty defined ditch. And this looks like relatively a do-nothing bank. It's not like there's a giant pocket cutting in here. And you have this long ridge that sticks out, and then you have a ditch that cuts through. This is probably a nice rocky point or something that sticks out. So that's a really interesting spot, and probably could congregate quite a few fish. And then here's another like little ditch that's kind of interesting. Again, it's a relatively flat bank, but that ditch cuts in from the channel straight into here. There's some higher spots here, and these fish could definitely set up in this little pocket and cove, but also out in front of it on some of these little points out here. You guys hopefully are getting the picture now of what I'm looking for. So this is the type of stuff that I'm checking out in the fall. If I'm trying to go fall fishing, guys, this is what I'm looking for 95% of the time, because I find that I can catch really quality fish and a lot of numbers doing this. And there are other patterns I will use in the fall, but most of the time these little ditches, these little depressions that are less obvious have always produced more fish for me. And it's something that I think a lot more guys are starting to understand, in the sense that you can go into the mouth of a little pocket or a cove like this, drop the forward facing sonar and just fish around with like a minnow and catch some fish. And so a lot of the more obvious kind of pockets and creeks and coves and things like that are getting a lot of fishing pressure. But I'm still finding that I can fish these smaller little ditch areas and have them to myself, because it takes a little bit more time, a little bit more thought into it than just pull up in a creek and start, fishing. And that alone can make a big difference. And I've been doing this for years. This isn't something new that I've been doing, but it's just shows how important map study can be in understanding your fisheries and finding something that's just a little bit different from what other anglers are doing. So hopefully this video made sense and gave you a new way of thinking about approaching lakes in the fall, regardless of what type of lake you're on. Let me know down in the comments if there's other types of lakes you'd like me to break down in these videos. I know that I get a lot of requests for northern natural lakes. I don't have a lot of experience on those, especially in the fall, and in the winter it's like ice fishing. So I'm trying to stick to more of the southern style lakes that I have a lot more experience on. That way I can share firsthand knowledge rather than trying to just regurgitate what I've heard from others. So let me know if there are lakes or specific things I'm maybe overlooking, or a certain scenario you think I should break down, because I can definitely do that in upcoming videos. Thanks again for checking out this video, guys. We'll see y'all next one.